So, Jai Bhim to all of you. Today we will be entering into the second session of our 6 week long course on uh, Baba Saheb Ambedkar's view on Constitution and constitutionalism. And we have already covered one session on the introduction to the topic and how the Constitution was developed. So today we will be looking at the principles underlying the constitutional law of India, and it's going to be, I hope, very exciting sort of a journey into the thoughts and vision of Baba Saheb Ambedkar in terms of how we understand the principles underlying the constitutional system. So let me begin with the presentation. Share. Wait. Okay. 1 minute. 1 minute. And here we go. So today we will be arriving at the second session of our course on Ambedkar Constitution and Constitutional Law. And in the second session, we'll be looking at the principles underlying the constitutional system, where we are going to deal with three important principles: the principle of democracy, the principle of federalism, and the principle of separation of power. And I'm going to talk more about the principle of democracy, and the remaining two, the principle of federalism and principle of separation of power, I'm going to touch upon briefly today, a slide or two, because they form a very substantial portion of the upcoming sessions. So I'm going to focus on the principle of democracy today. So let's enter into the topic today. So I thought, we should bear in mind how we can structure the constitutional conversation. Which, if we look at the constitution, the way Charles Black has mentioned in the structure and relationship in constitution law, he have made a very meaningful statement in the context of the American Constitution, where he says that meaning should be found not only in the four corners of the document, which means the written constitution, but as it were in the angles and shapes of its joints and seams, reading not only the lines of the text, but between the lines, focusing as closely on how the pieces fit together as on their individual shapes. So if we look at the constitution in its totality, connect all the pieces together, we can find that the underlying principles remains the same: the principle of democracy, federalism, and the separation of power. However, we arrive at only this fundamental structure of the overarching principles of democracy, federalism, and separation of power. So I thought, that should give us a kind of a vantage point from which we can structure the conversation on the constitution. So when we talk about the constitution, we talk about the constitution in many different ways, but I found this is a very suitable way of looking at the constitution through various framework. So as we have seen in the past session, the constitution has a legal framework where the constitution is the supreme law of land. There is no law above the constitution, and in the constitution as a law operates in a very legalistic term, giving safeguards to the citizens of the country. Sometimes the constitutional law is equated with the fundamental rights of the citizens, but Baba Sahib says that it's much more bigger than mere fundamental rights. So you see, this is constitutional law as a legal framework where the constitution is the supreme law of the land. There is nothing above the constitution. Every law, every single law has to obey the constitution. Then we know that the constitution also act as a policy making framework. So the constitution provides a framework for policy making where the action is determined in terms of the legislation acts, and the action by the executive and the test of the constitutionality by the Supreme Court or the court system itself. So you see, the constitution also act as a framework for policy making, and we were going to elaborate on that a little bit in the upcoming session. And also, constitution acts as institutional framework. It provides institutions of the government, the organs, I would say, of the government, and in the case of India, the parliamentary democracy. And very importantly, the fifth point is the constitution also offers the unity framework. However, the country is divided into several social groups, the Constitution offers as unity framework. The Constitution itself begins with the unity, underlying principle of unity in terms of we the people. It doesn't segregate the people into different groups. It says that, ultimately we have to seek the unity of the country or the unity of the people, and it offers the framework of the unity. I think these five frameworks are very important for the discussion on the Constitution. Now, to look at how Baba Sahib Ambedkar approaches anything, I found these four ways by which Baba Sahib Ambedkar looks at everything. He tries to define why before he launch an inquiry into something, he tries to define it. Secondly, he tries to find out the underlying principles and the deadlocks and the contradictions that underlying what is reality and what are the principles. And ultimately, Baba Sahib Ambedkar seeks to find out the methods. So we bear this framework of approaching anything, when it comes to the Constitution. We have to see how different definitions are involved to define certain things. In case of today's session, democracy, and we are going to see the ample numbers of definitions of the democracy, then the principles underlying, the premises underlying those definitions, and the contradictions, and how to resolve the contradiction through different methods. So you see, this is the framework that we can find out in the writings of Baba Sahib Ambedkar. This is the way we analytically look at anything. So let's look at why principles of very important. So Baba Sahib Ambedkar says that the principles precedes methods. So we have to understand the principles. And Baba Sahib says that there being no principle, there is no guide to tell why a particular method has failed. There being no principle, there is no assurance that the new method will succeed. So we have to always come back to the principles. We have to come back to the fundamental premises on which something has been structured. And Baba Sahib Ambedkar further says the defect in the present approach is that it proceeds by method instead of by principles. The principle is that there is no principle. So he's of course commenting on the constitutional history of India, the previous the events, and he says that there is only a series of methods. If one method fails, another is tried. It is this swing from one method to another which has made the communal problem a jigsaw puzzle. And he says, there being no principle, there is no guide to tell why a particular method has failed. There being no principle, there is no assurance that the new method will succeed. So we have to bear in mind that the principles are very important, and we are going to dabble with some of the principles today. We know that whenever we would talk about democracy, we have to talk about the different cracies, as it were. And democracy is, of course, the rule by the people, and the model is republic republic is a democratic model where the people elect the government and they have the power to officiate the government, any office in the governance. Now, if of course there is a rule by law, which is called the autocracy, which results into dictatorship or monarchy. And of course, a rule by one or dictatorship or monarchy or autocracy is no way beneficial to the larger humanity, and people have challenged the autocratic governance throughout the history. Then there is another form of the government, which is ruled by religion, where the constitution is taken over by the religious laws. We can find that in some of the countries the religion is held above the constitution, and they are the theocratic states, like we can say the Vatican City, even to some extent our neighboring countries, which defines itself as a Islamic republic, and so on and so forth. And there are the countries in the Middle East where they claim to be governed by the laws based on the religious laws. Then there is, of course, rule by a few, oligarchy, a few powerful people, they come together and they rule, and it leads to totalitarianism. That is the case, we can say, about China, where a particular party and their members rule, and of course it leads to curtail of the freedom, individual freedom, and so on and so forth. Rule by rich people, it's called a plutocracy, and ultimately the rule by the democracy. So these are some of the forms of the government that I thought we should put in front before we launch the inquiry into definitions of democracy. So Baba Ambedkar has given many definitions, and as we know that he was very much impressed by his teacher John Dewey, and many of the definitions of democracy Baba Ambedkar gave, they coincide with the definitions of John Dewey. John Dewey was, of course, having a strong impact on Baba Saheb Ambedkar. Baba Saheb Ambedkar has said that I owe my intellectual life to John Dewey, and his book Democracy and Education has a deep impact on Baba Saheb Ambedkar up to the end of his life. Whenever he was examining the democracy, in fact, he asked one of his students to make available a very old paper of John Dewey when he was writing a book. And I think the book in question that time must be this book that Dr. Baba Ambedkar was writing, of which the book plan is available and the introduction is available, and we are building on his book plan. So I think that in context to that, Baba Ambedkar was requesting at the end of when he undertook to write, I think, this book, to read a very old paper of John Dewey, Ethics of Democracy. So he was influenced by thinking and thought process of John Dewey. But we know that he has invented a lot of things of his own, and he has we can say that he was a original thinker of democracy in terms of what we are going to study together. So Baba Ambedkar had cited this definition of democracy by a writer of a book on English Constitution, Walter Bagehot, and where he talks about government by discussion and not by fisticuffs. So, that's how Baba Ambedkar talks about the French Parliament and the British Parliament. He says a British Parliament, there is, government by discussion, but sometimes the French Parliament, there people comes to the blows, and, they sometimes, indulge into fisticuffs, like fights. So Baba Ambedkar says that the definition, the definition of democracy, one of the definition of the democracy is the government by discussion. And in the today's parlance, we can say that it's a deliberative democracy, where the things or the actions are decided, the laws are made, with a thorough discussion, finding out the pros and cons of that particular action involved. So this is a very beautiful definition that Baba Ambedkar has given, and citing Walter Bagehot. Then, of course, Lincoln had a very deep impact on Baba Sahib's thinking, and this Lincolnian definition, which he gave in the Gettysburg Address, which is sort of underlying principle of democracy, is government of the people, for the people, and by the people. And Baba Ambedkar has cited this definition a few times, and he was very fond of Lincoln, as we know from his life. And of course, this is a Deweyan definition. Democracy is not merely a form of government. It is primarily a mode of associated living, of conjoined communicated experience. It is essentially an attitude of respect and reverence towards fellow human beings, fellow men, fellow women. And this is, I think, very important principle, of the definition, that it's not just a form of government. It is much more deeper in the scheme of Baba Ambedkar. And Baba Ambedkar, of course, talks about democracy in terms of the self-government, self-determination. And he makes a very interesting comment. He says that democracy is always changing its forms. Though the principle doesn't change, the form changes even in the same country. So he talks about the history of democracy in Britain, as to how the form of the democracy changed from time to time. And he says that democracy not only changes in the form, but it also undergoes change in the purpose. And he says that the purpose of the modern democracy is not so much to put a curb on an autocratic king, but to bring about the welfare of people. I think we should bear this definition of democracy in our mind. Now, as we begin our session one with what is constitution and constitutionalism, the underlying principle of the constitution is democracy. And though this word is talked about, referred in the preamble, it's so obvious that India was democracy, that we the people of India having solemnly resolved to constitute India into sovereign socialist democratic republic. So you see, the democracy is the underlying principle of the constitution of our country, and therefore we have to understand the definitions of democracy to the great extent. And of course, the purpose of democracy is not just to put a curb on any autocratic king, but to bring about the welfare of people. So these definitions are very important. And democracy is also free and fair election, no interference from the big businesses. That's what Baba Ambedkar says, that if there is an interference from any big businesses or any pressure group in the elections, then there is no democracy. So democracy is, of course, free and fair elections, and of course periodic elections. And Baba Ambedkar also defines democracy as must have opposition parties. If there is a one party rule, covertly or overtly, it is the death of democracy. There cannot be democracy, because then the citizens only know one side of the things, they don't know the other side of the things. So the existence of the opposition party, points out to the presence of democracy. If there is only one party system, there is no democracy. How much you glorify it. If there is no contradictory voices, democracy is of course having many contradictory voices, brought together in a consensus, and there should be harmony in action, to use the words of Baba Saheb Ambedkar. But this definition, Baba Saheb Ambedkar himself said, is his definition. The definition that I'm going to talk about is democracy is a form of and method of government whereby revolutionary changes in the economic and social life of the people are brought without bloodshed. So when Baba Ambedkar gives a lot of definitions of democracy, but this definition, he says, this is what I profess, that democracy is a form, is also a form. So the government has to be organized in such a way that the revolutionary changes in the economic and political, in the social life of the people are brought without bloodshed. So this is the definition of Baba Ambedkar when it comes to democracy. Also, Baba Ambedkar goes on defining the democracy further. The principle of self-government expresses the desire of the people to rule itself rather than be ruled by others, whether the rulers be absolute monarchs, dictators, or privileged classes. It is democracy, the principle of self-government. And how it is expressed? The desire of the people to rule itself rather than be ruled by others, whether the rulers be absolute monarchs, dictators, or privileged classes. And as we have seen, democracy is not only the government for the people, but by the people. It is not, it has to involve the people. And Baba Ambedkar again quotes another definition. Democracy is quite different from a republic as well as from parliamentary government. The roots of democracy lie not in the form of government, parliamentary or otherwise. A democracy is more than a form of government. It is primarily a mode of associated living. The roots of democracy are to be searched in the social relationship, in terms of the associated life between the people who form a society. So you see, the way Baba Ambedkar defines the democracy in different ways, it gives us a kind of the underlying principles behind democracy. He says democracy is the interlinkage of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And I'm going to give you a more, elongated, longer quote. Democracy is also a way of life. It is not just a form of government. And Baba Ambedkar says society is no doubt stably organized when each individual is doing that for which he has aptitude by nature in such a way as to be useful to others. And that it is the business of society to discover these aptitudes and progressively to train them for social use. But there is in a man an indefinite pluralities of capacities and activities which may characterize an individual. So, we all are different. We have different capacities. We have different, activities that we are good at. And, and that's what, make us an individual. No two human beings are same. We are all unique human beings. So this is what Baba Ambedkar says: a society to be democratic should open a way to use all the capacities of the individual. Stratification, like the caste system or racism or any form of stratification, is stunting of the growth of the individual, and deliberate stunting is a deliberate denial of democracy. So if in a society there is a stratification, watertight compartment, the society is divided into, groups, warring camps, then in that we can say that that stratification is the, denial, is a deliberate denial of democracy. So the caste system is the deliberate denial of democracy. And Baba Ambedkar again, quotes John Dewey: growth and the cultivation of human personality is democracy. That's the highest way. The democracy has to, lead to the growth and the cultivation of human personality. And this is a very beautiful definition of Baba Ambedkar. Democracy should mirror the mind of the electorate in its representation. That means the parliament has to represent the different opinions of the groups in the society. And that is the case for the representative democracy. Baba Ambedkar didn't just stop there. He has given, deeper and many definitions of democracy. For example, he talked about democracy in terms of the intellectual, moral, and social democracy. So Baba Ambedkar put in place the parliamentary democracy by way of constitution, but his ideal form of democracy was intellectual, moral, and social. And he made it clear in the objectives of the People's Education Society. So there Baba Ambedkar says this: the People's Education Society's objective is not merely to give education, but give education in such manner as to promote intellectual, moral, and social democracy. They're very important. And this is what modern India needs, and this is what all well-wishers of India must promote. So you see, we have seen many forms, many definitions of democracy, but I think this is one of the very interesting definitions of democracy, or the classifications of democracy, that Dr. Baba Ambedkar has incorporated in the objectives of the People's Education Society, where he talks about intellectual, moral, and social democracy. And he says that this is what modern India needs, and this is what all well-wishers of India must promote. Now, what is social democracy? The question naturally arises. So, according to Baba Saheb Ambedkar and his deep analysis, it means a way of life which recognizes liberty, equality, and fraternity as principles of life. You see, though, so the democracy is, in essence, is a principle of life. That's how we should be living our life. We cannot live our life in an autocratic way, in an anarchical way. There has to be a principle of life, and that underlying principle of life recognizes liberty, equality, and fraternity. And as Baba Ambedkar goes further, he says these principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity are not to be treated as separate items in Trinity. They form a union of Trinity, in the sense that to divorce one from the other is to defeat the very purpose of democracy. You see, it's a beautiful, the kind of definitions, the kind of insights that Baba Ambedkar provides, to study something. Now, this is democracy. This is the underlying principle of the Constitution. This is the most vital and the main principle of our Constitution, democracy. Anybody is trying to undermine democracy in India is actually trying to liquidate our country. We have to bear this in mind, and we have to know what is the democracy, and that's how Baba Ambedkar defines democracy in a very deep manner. Also, Baba Ambedkar has talked about the economic democracy. There can be a larger discussion. I'm not going to go into that. But the principles underlying economic democracy is very important. According to Baba Ambedkar, there are various ways in which people believe that economic democracy can be brought about. There are those who believe in individualism as the best form of economic democracy, like capitalism, for example. There are those who believe in having a socialistic state as the best form of economic democracy. There are those who believe in the communistic ideas as the most perfect form of economic democracy. We have deliberately introduced in the language, in the Constitution, that we have used in the directive principle something which is not fixed or rigid. And we have left enough room for people of different ways of thinking with regard to reaching of the ideal of economic democracy, to strive in their own way to persuade the electorate that is the best way of reaching economic democracy. That's what Baba Ambedkar says. And of course, Baba Ambedkar was the promoter of the representative democracy. He says it should mirror. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I did.
Wait 1 minute. What is it? Wait 1 minute. Okay. Okay, are you there? Are we still there?
Yes, sir, we are there.
Okay, okay.
Yes.
Okay, because I kept the room open. So can somebody watch out for that? That kind of problem should not arise. Okay. So let's go back to representative democracy, and it's a real and effective representation for the minorities. Absolute majority versus relative majority. That's a very important concept which Baba Ambedkar has talked about when he talks about the representative democracy, that the electorate or the houses of the parliament should mirror the mind of the electorate or the people. And he talks about the political majority versus communal majority. He says that we have a big issue with what is called the communal majority, because in India, Baba Sahib says the communal majority is born because of the caste system. It's not created. The political majority has to be created, while the communal majority just comes into being. because of the birth. So these are some key concepts. Participation in a group is the only way of being like-minded with the group. Each group tends to create its own distinctive type of like-mindedness. But where there are more groups than one to be brought into political union, there would be conflict among the differently like-minded. And so long as the group remains isolated, the conflict is bound to continue and prevent the harmony of action. The touchables means the caste Hindus have enough communication between them to ensure us to say that the conflict of like-mindedness, so far as they are concerned, is not much to be dreaded. But there is a real difference and consequent conflict between the like-mindedness of the touchables and the untouchables. These are very deep concepts. If we have to unpack these concepts, we will take a lot of time because they are so fundamental to understand what is a representative democracy, why there has to be reservation, why there has to be representation, how the absolute majority has to be converted into relative majority so that the minorities should not be oppressed, and what minorities should have the safeguards. These are all very deep concepts of the democracy which Baba Ambedkar has underlined. And communal representation, people talk against it, but this is what Baba Ambedkar says. Communal representation is a device to ward off the evil effect of the divisions. To those who, while agreeing to this particular benefit of communal representation, object to it on the score that it perpetuates the divisions, it can be shown that there is another perspective from which it can be said that the communal representation, instead of perpetuating the social divisions, is one of the ways of dissolving them. While communal electorate will be coterminous with social divisions, their chief effect will be to bring together men from different diverse castes who would not otherwise mix together into legislative council. So you see how important it is to have the discussions, the deliberative democracy, where the different groups come together and deliberate, because that's where the social indo-osmosis can take place. I thought this is important slide because Baba Ambedkar has talked about Buddhism and democracy in 1941. Long back he has talked about this needs a lot of thinking, but I just wanted to put it in this slide in the presentation to let you know that the Buddhism and the democracy has a long connection, and this is very important. He says that the doctor who can wash this filth with will help in establishing democracy in India. That doctor undoubtedly is the Buddha. The lifeblood of Hindus cannot be purified by celebrating Rama Jayanti or Krishna Jayanti or Gandhi Jayanti. Rama, Krishna, and Gandhi are the worshippers of the Brahmanism. They are useless in the establishment of democracy. The Buddha can only help in establishing democracy. Therefore, it is important to remember the Buddha and take his medicine for cleansing the political and social lifeblood of Hindus. Therefore, we think that people should chant this great mantra for establishment of democracy. Buddhang Saranam Gacchami, Dhammang Saranam Gacchami, Sangham Saranam Gacchami. Baba Ambedkar goes on explaining why, how Buddha can promote the democracy. Now, we were talking about the different definitions. Let's look at the four fundamental premises of political democracy. Very important. And Baba Ambedkar has stated those four fundamental premises of democracy in the state and minority. Pay attention because they come from the long tradition of enlightenment. They come from Thomas Paine. And I'm going to touch briefly on the current debates in the world today. But suffice here to keep in your mind, these are the fundamental four premises of political democracy. What are they? The individual is an end in himself, isn't it? The value of an individual is axiomatic. So whoever is born in the world, they have a value and they are an end in themselves. Okay. Now the second, that the individual has certain inalienable. The meaning of the word inalienable is something that cannot be taken away or denied. So every individual, every human being is endowed with inalienable rights, which must be guaranteed to him by the Constitution. Okay, these are the fundamental premises of the political democracy. And the third, the individual shall not be required to relinquish any of his constitutional rights as a condition precedent to the recipient of a privilege. So you see the fundamental rights of the individual precedes the constitutional rights, and there are natural rights. Nobody can take away from an individual, and that the state shall not delegate powers to private persons to govern others. Very fundamental. An individual cannot be governed by another individual, and the state cannot delegate the powers to private persons to govern others. Keep these four fundamental premises of political democracy in your mind. They are very helpful to think through things. So fundamental principles of democracy. What are the fundamental principles of democracy? Let's look at them. So father of all moral principles is this, that all men, people are created equal. This is the fundamental principle. This is the principle on which the American Constitution is founded on. This is the fundamental principle that all men, these people, men and women, are created equal. No man is good enough to govern another man without that other's consent. This is the leading principle, the sheet anchor of any republic. Without that, no republic can come into being. That no man, however great they are, is not good enough to govern another man without that other's consent. Means without our consent, nobody should be able to govern us. That means there should not be slavery. We cannot be enslaved by any other human being. No man is by nature the ruler of other man. An abstract truth applicable to all times and places. The fourth fundamental principle is the consent of the governed is the premise of a democracy. So if there is any government, that has to have the consent of the people. The powers of the government are derived from the consent of the governed. Rights that arise from the nature, as I told you, they are inalienable rights. Nobody can take them away from us. Even the constitutional rights cannot take them away from us. And we were going to look into those, how that is managed in the constitution. You see, the study of the constitution is very important. Very, very important for a person to live a free life. And not a lot of people are educated in the constitution. And the constitution is not something which is abstract. It can be understood by any common man. It's not something very philosophical. I'm going to tell you how it is not philosophical. It's very day to day. It's a common sense that all men, people are created equal. In India, that principle is denied by the caste system. And the second is, no man is good enough to govern another man without that other's consent. This is the leading principle, the sheet anchor of any republic. And no man is by nature the ruler of other men. An abstract truth applicable to all times and places. The consent of the governed is the premise of a democracy. The powers of the government are derived from the consent of the governed. Rights that arise from nature. Rights that will hold for all people, all places, all times. Now let's go. As I was telling you, that it's not abstract philosophical thing. It can be understood by anybody. We don't have to go for this doctrine of relativism, to say that people are unequal and these and that, people are born by. You cannot take it. We cannot go into that discussion at all, because they are the axiomatic things. From there springs the democratic values. From there springs the constitution. So doctrine of relativism is not validated when it comes to axiomatic, self-evident, and inalienable truths. These are the truths, isn't it? Then there are two ways by which we can look into the truths, contingent and truths and categorical truths. They are the categorical truths that all men are born equal. There is no question for that. Nobody can raise the question for that. And the foundation of Indian Republic, comes from the natural laws from which moral truth flows, which are easily understood by common. Anybody can understand that, and anybody can understand what are the most important rights. We can understand the right to life is the most fundamental right. It is not right to see a movie. Of course, that's the right, but that cannot be higher than the right to live, right to life. So, we all have the sense of the practical ranking or ordering the rights. They are demonstrated in the experiments that the equality is very basic to the human beings. It's now determined by the experiments. And this is what Baba Ambedkar says when it comes to the rights, which are the foundation of any democracy. Baba Ambedkar is very deep when he talks like this. He says, the rights of man must be translated into terms which common man can understand. Isn't it? So in a way, how we can translate the values, the fundamental principles of the constitution in the language of the common man, namely peace, whether there is a peace in the country. Now you all have to judge. A house, whether people have a house, adequate clothing, whether they have adequate clothing, education, good health, and this is very important. And above all, the right to walk with dignity on the world's great boulevards without fear of a fall. In other words, dignity is the fundamental rights. People should know whether they're living the dignified life or they are living an undignified life. Now, why I thought I should bring this Lincoln's exercise in thinking about equality, because equality is so fundamental to the democracy, so fundamental to the constitution. Now he has argued like this when it came to the slavery, and we can apply the similar argument here. He says, you say A is white and B is black, it is color. Then the lighter having the right to enslave the darker, right? So he says, take care. By this rule, you are to be slave to the first man you meet with a fairer skin than your own. So color cannot be ground. Then you do not mean color exactly. You mean the whites are intellectually the superiors of the blacks and therefore have the right to enslave them. Now take care again. By this rule, you are to be slave to the first man you meet with an intellect superior to your own. But say you, it is a question of interest, and if you can make it your interest, you have the right to enslave another very well. As if he can make it his interest, he has the right to enslave you. So there is no ground for one person, whether they are blacks or they so-called India's upper caste, or man, or women, whoever they have no right to enslave the others. No right at all. There is no moral ground. And this exercise in thinking proves that we have the fundamental principles of any government, any democracy, any constitutional law is equality. So Baba Ambedkar had also given us the brief history of democracy, which I think is very important for all of us to understand. That he said that all is not well with the parliamentary democracy, and he has cautioned Indians that be aware of parliamentary democracy, because though the parliamentary arose after the French Revolution, which gave the principle of self-government and self-determination. These are the principles that we can go deeply, but I'm not going to go into. And self-government is right to not be governed by others. Okay, self determination to determine the destiny for oneself. And the French Revolution also gave rise to the values of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Parliamentary democracy in many countries became reality following the French Revolution. That is the history of democracy. However, the parliamentary democracies, in their manifestation as a popular government, failed in several countries. And the parliamentary democracy transformed into fascism and Nazism. And Baba Ambedkar says, beware of parliamentary democracy. It is not the best product as you think. And he says that the failure of parliamentary democracy was directly related to the degree of failure of social and economic democracy. And many times Baba Ambedkar has brought these contradictions out, and he said that the failure of democracy was directly related to the degree of failure of social and economic democracy in the countries like Spain, Italy, and Germany. We saw the rise of fascist powers. The parliamentary democracy failed due to lower achievements in the sphere of social and economic democracy. The countries such as America and England, where the social and economic democracies were relatively stronger, the parliamentary democracy thrived to a greater extent. And democracy is a machinery whose movements are very slow. It delays swift action. It can pave a way for dictatorship, as it does not give a free hand to the dictators. And that is why democracies become discredited institution in the countries like Italy, Spain, and Germany. You bear now the current situation in the world. Think about today's India, okay? Thus, to ensure the strong political democracy, Dr. Baba Ambedkar remarked that social and economic democracy are the tissues and the fiber of a political democracy. There cannot be political democracy, there cannot be parliamentary democracy if there is no strong social and economic democracy. And we have seen what Baba Ambedkar meant by the social and economic democracy. And you see, like fascism, Nazism, and Brahmanism, they are the same thing. They all talk about the stratification, the negation of democracy. Nazism, fascism, Brahmanism is an antithesis of democracy, as according to Baba Ambedkar, the Nazi order, fascism, and Brahmanism suppresses liberty, denies equality, and expunges fraternity. So it's a complete antithesis of democracy. Nazism enunciates the creed of racial gradation. In the Nazi social order, the German race was to be the race of Superman, the white race was to be survival to the German race, and the brown race was to have the last place, which will have no education. The brown race is, of course, Indians. That's what Hitler thought. And you see, it's very surprising that in India, Hitler is lauded so much. Nazism is lauded because it matches with Brahmanism. So the functioning of democracy, the democracy in its functioning must expand. What should democracy do when it functions? It should expand notion of equality of political rights. In other words, universal adult franchise, principle of social and economic opportunities, and the state cannot be held at bay by corporations like capitalist groups, which are antisocial in purpose because their nature is antisocial. They seek only profits. The parliamentary democracy has failed to ensure to the masses the right to liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. And therefore, Baba Ambedkar says, be aware of the parliamentary democracy. One man, one vote is a parliamentary democracy or a political democracy. But if there is no one man, one value, the democracy can be torn asunder. So what Baba Ambedkar says that there has to be equality means abolition of privileges of every kind. Now we know that India there are certain caste, they have the born privileges. Baba Ambedkar says that there cannot be, privileges for any person. In the civil services, they have the privileges in the army, in taxation, in trade, and in industry. In short, equality means abolition of all processes which leads to inequality. It also means equality of opportunity for all. The every single sentence can be further analyzed and thought through. And Baba Ambedkar says, what is fraternity? He says, fraternity means peace on earth and goodwill towards man. And he's talking about these principles very early on. Baba Ambedkar further says, capitalism and parliamentary democracy says that the capitalistic form of industrial organization and political organization called parliamentary democracy leads to two contradictions. And that glaring contradictions even we can see in today's India. Fabulous wealth for a few and abject poverty for the masses. And another is equality in politics and inequality in economics. These are all very deep definitions of democracy. And what is the relationship of nationalism and democracy? Democratic man is always believing in the human rights. Like in England, the highest law is the human rights. The highest right is the human rights. They have, in fact, the act called the Human Rights Act. I think maybe 1993. And you see, this is very important when it talks in context with the laborers. Labor's creed is internationalism. That means humanism is ultimate principle. Labor is interested in nationalism only because the wills of democracy. What are the wills of democracy? To have a representative parliaments, responsible executives, constitutional convention, etc. Work better in a community united by national sentiments. So, in order for the democracy to run like an efficient machinery, there has to be the national sentiments. But we see what happens to the concept of nationalism in India. It is equated with religion. It's equated with all that nonsense, but it's never equated with democracy. Democracy is, the nationalism and democracy go hand in hand together when it comes to the Constitution of India, the underlying principles of the Constitution of India. So nationalism to labor, like the vast population of India, is only a means to an end. It is not an end in itself to which labor can agree to sacrifice what is regarded as the most essential principles of life. So conditions for the democracy to exist and arise, as Baba Ambedkar said, that in the society there should not be glaring inequality. Some inequality is okay, but there should not be glaring inequality. There should be the existence of the opposition parties. There should be equality of law and administration, and there has to be the respect for the constitution, which is known as the constitutional morality. You have to respect the constitution because all the institutions are created by the constitution. And therefore, the constitutional morality is very important. And Baba Ambedkar says that there has to be public conscience. In India, the public conscience is absent because the Indians are divided into so many castes and so many creeds. And Baba Ambedkar says that democracy in India has a lot of challenges because there is a governing class. And the parenthesis, I have added the parenthesis. So he says why the governing class can destroy the democracy. He says that there is a governing class in India. As we know, there is a Brahman Baniya axis of power in this country. The governing class is inconsistent with the democracy. Wherever there is a permanent governing class, it's inconsistent with the democracy. We can see this in the judiciary. How many SC, ST, OBCs there are. We can see in the executive how many SC, ST, OBCs there are. There are a group of people, a particular caste, they only are there. And democracy comes into being when the governing class loses its power, isn't it? So the power should be with the people, not with a class of people. Democracy is not for class of people. It's for the masses. It's for everybody. The servile classes, in our case, the depressed classes and backward classes may need other safeguards as well. And it matters what is the philosophy of the governing class. So we have to understand what is the philosophy of the governing class in India. It's Brahmanism. It's not democracy. It's a very different, social philosophy. So what we need, what India needs for unity, do we follow the constitutional methods or anarchy, the grammar of anarchy? These are the questions raised by Baba Ambedkar. In today's context, do we want to replace Indian democracy, whatever form it has, with the authoritarian Hindutva or anarchy or communism? Okay. And Baba Ambedkar has cautioned, if we disregard the democracy and constitution, it might lead to the balkanization of India. We never know. So what we need is a continuous stress on we the people, and unless we create an identity of an Indian who believes in the constitution, who believes in the democracy, our country will find a lot of challenges in the future. That's what Baba Ambedkar says. So this is about democracy, and I'm going to talk a little bit about democracy, in the subsequent time. But let me come to the principles of federalism. I'm not going to spend a lot of time there, but because I'm going to speak about federalism in the coming sessions. So in India, in the constitution, there is a dual polity, union government and the state government, and dual polity, of course, means a central government and the state government. And the principle is whether there is a single citizenship or dual citizenship. So in America, there is a dual citizenship. You are the citizen of America, also the citizen of the state you live in. But in India, there is a single citizenship. There is no citizenship like a Maharashtrian citizen or Tamil citizen like that. There is only one citizenship, that is the Indian citizenship. Then there is a single framework to govern both the union and the states. So we have a single constitution. In case of America, they have two constitutions. One is a union constitution and the state constitution. There is a separation of powers between the union government and state government, and the separation of legislative, executive, and judicial powers. And we can see that there are three lists in the constitution. So these are the underlying principles, that there should be a federal polity, there should be a dual polity. Not only the central government, there has to be the unit of governance, and we are going to look into that, how the states are formed, and compare with America, England, and other countries. But you see, this is very important to look into the principles of federalism. Then principles of separation of power, which is very important in the democracy because it offers the checks and balances on the different organs of the government. So there is a institution, organ of the government which makes lawmaking body, which is also called the legislature, which involves, in the case of India, president and the two houses of parliament, which determine the action and execution. There is an executive body headed by the ministers, and they are responsible to the parliament and the action and execution. So they execute, they actually act. And the good government is good law and good administration. So administration is very, very, very crucial to the democracy, good administration. Then the judiciary is there to review the action. It's called the judicial review, or test the constitutionality of certain acts. And the legislative power, as we know, is divided between the president, Lok Sabha, and Rajya Sabha. And we are going to see how democratic they are in the subsequent session. And there is liberty is only safeguarded by the separation of powers. And the checks and balances is the principle of government under which separate organs are empowered to prevent actions by other organs and are induced to share power. So sharing of the power is very important. Checks and balances are essential for securing liberty, and of course, the procedure established by law, the rule of law, the supremacy of the rule of law. We are going to look into the fifth session at length. And these are the organs of the state. As I told you, in the parliamentary democracy, there is a legislature to express the voice of the people. These are wordings of Baba Ambedkar. The legislature must express the voice of the people. There is the executive, which is subordinate to the legislature and bound to obey the legislature. Over and above the legislature and the executive, there is the custodian of the constitution, the judiciary, to control both and keep them both within the prescribed bounds of the constitution, prescribed bounds of democracy. Now, these are the principles which we have to bear in mind, and based on that, we have to see what is happening in this country. I thought just to offer you some intellectual fodder. In the world today, the political camps are divided into conservatives and liberals. And the two examples of liberal, now these two modes of thoughts are Penn and Burke, Edmund Burke. And we have seen the thinking of the Thomas Penn in the previous slides. But we he's a liberal figure, and Burke is, of course, considered to be conservative, like the French way of thinking and the British way of thinking. And where is Baba Ambedkar quotes both extensively. He quotes Burke time and again. So what is it about Baba Ambedkar? Is it a liberal or conservative, or is it a Buddhist? Whether he's for revolution or reformation, and whether he's for bloody revolution or bloodless revolution. These are all questions that I think we have to raise today. Whether the constitution or the principles of democracy are valid today, how we can actualize those principles, and these are the questions. So I thought, in the larger contours of the political debates that are taking place in the world in terms of liberalism and conservatism, I think we have to see what we can we can we can understand of Baba Ambedkar. So Baba Ambedkar has said famously that reformation of the mind of the man and mind of the world is very important. World cannot be changed without that. And this is a very famous statement of Thomas Paine. All delegated power is a trust, and all assumed power is usurpation. Usurpation. So let me just quote a few things from Edward Burke that Baba Ambedkar quoted. So we have seen the word public conscience, where he uses Burke uses, and Baba Ambedkar has cited this. There is no method found for punishing the multitude. Law can punish a single solitary recalcitrant criminal. It can never operate against a whole body of people who are determined to defy it. So this is the case of India. Social conscience is the only safeguard of all rights, fundamental or non-fundamental. And that's what Baba Ambedkar thought, that the society has to be reformed. The society, without a democratic society, there cannot be a democracy. And this is what Baba Ambedkar has quoted in the speech of 17 December, I think 9 December 1946, the first speech in the Parliamentary Assembly. Now, to end up with the discussion on democracy, I thought this quote from Baba Ambedkar is very instructive, and it can effect some change in the way we think about what is happening in India today. I have titled this as intellectual democracy. This is what Baba Ambedkar says: democracy has ceased to exercise its intelligence. It has bound itself hand and foot to one organization and only one. It is not prepared to sit in judgment over the doings or thinking of this organization. Now, in that case, there was a Congress party. Now, imagine what is happening in India today. I consider it the greatest malaise, a disease, and a sickness. It has affected all our people. They are intoxicated. That's what Baba Ambedkar says. Unfortunately, Indian people are by tradition men and women who have more faith and less wit or intelligence. Anyone who does anything out of the ordinary, does something so eccentric as to be called in other countries an insane person, acquires in this country the status of a Mahatma or Yogi. These are the words of Baba Ambedkar. And people follow him as the sheep follows the shepherd. Isn't it? That's what Baba Ambedkar talks, that there is a lack of intellectual democracy. What I thought, I wanted to bring something to you today in terms of unity. Baba Ambedkar has talked about unity, and what I'm going to do is, stop here, and I'm going to go into some things which are very important, and that will, help give us a lot of food for thought. You see, Baba Ambedkar has always talked about the unity of the country, and the speech of the 7 December 1946, that is what Baba Ambedkar says, that I know today we are divided politically, socially, and economically. We are a group of warring camps, and I may go even to the extent of confessing that I am probably one of the leaders of such a camp. But, sir, with all this, I am quite convinced that given time and circumstances, nothing in the world will prevent this country from becoming one. With all our caste and creeds, I have not the slightest hesitation that we shall in some form be a united people. So we the people is an underscoring idea of the principle of democracy, and that's how we can secure our country. And Baba Ambedkar is a very I would say prophetic, and he is somebody who can see through what's going to happen to the country, and he cites he's somebody who is always trying to find the solutions. He's not somebody who will be struck with the ideas. So to the Hindus he told that this is a very important message that Baba Ambedkar has given. He said that there is a need of the opposition. You cannot just have one voice in the country. You cannot just have the one opinion in the country. You should have multiple opinions, and they should be channelized into harmony for a common action. And if there is only single opinion, then it's a denial of democracy. And he says that because we are told now that in India, even that time, Indians were told that the opposition is an evil. There has to be only one vision for the country. But Baba Ambedkar says that in the past we have the system where we try to debate with each other, and he talks about how the interpreters interpreted the Vedas and the Smritis. I think these are very important for the Hindus to realize that they always had, this addition, this concept of, interpreting and understanding the things from different point of views. And so the opposition or the divergent views are very important. That's what Baba Ambedkar is making a point. That's in fact is the democracy to channelize. So Baba Ambedkar has given these examples there. But I'm going to end the today's presentation by talking about, what Baba Ambedkar called Brahmaism. So he said that there are actually three strands in the philosophical and religious thoughts of the Hindus. Now, Baba Ambedkar is totally convinced about Buddhism. In Buddhism, we can find all the methods and principles that leads to the democracy, And Baba Ambedkar has very beautifully put them, very clearly put them. But, he talks about the Hindus, and he says that there are three strands in the philosophical and religious thoughts of the Hindus. They may be designated as Brahmaism, Vedanta, and Brahmanism. Three words, very important. Brahmaism, Vedanta, and Brahmanism. And he says that the essence of Brahmaism, not Brahmanism, Brahmaism, is summed up in a dogma which is stated in three different forms. They are Sarvam Khalavidam Brahma. All this is Brahma. The first principle is all this is Brahma. Aham Brahmasmi means self is the same as Brahma. Therefore, I am Brahma. And Tattvamasi means Atma. Self is the same as Brahma. Therefore, thou are also Brahma. So Baba Ambedkar says that these principles of Brahmaism, not Brahmanism, can be a theoretical foundation of the democracy if the Hindus are really serious about democracy. And he says that I am Brahma. It will be an arrogant statement, but to say that you are also Brahma, it creates a ground for what is called equality. And he says that it makes a democracy an obligation for one and all. So, but there is a contradiction. There is no Brahmaism. There is only Brahmanism, which is the complete denial of the democracy because of the strict ratification. And this is what Baba Ambedkar says, that why then Brahmaism failed to produce a new society? This is a great riddle. It is not that the Brahmins did not recognize the doctrine of Brahmaism. They did, but they did not ask how they could support inequality between the Brahmins and the Shudras, between man and women, between caste man and outcast. But they did not. The result is that we have, on one hand, the most democratic principle of Brahmaism, and on the other hand, a society infested with caste, subcaste, primitive tribes, and criminal tribes. Can there be a greater dilemma than this? What is more ridiculous is the teaching of the great Shankaracharya, for it was this Shankaracharya who taught that there is Brahma, and this Brahma is real, and that it pervades all, and at the same time upheld all the iniquities of the Brahminic society. Only a lunatic could be happy with being the propounder of two such contradictions, truly as the Brahmin is like a cow. Baba Ambedkar says that the Brahmin is like a cow. He can eat anything and everything as the cow does and remain a Brahmin. So unless we do away with Brahmanism in this country, we cannot have a real and true democracy. So I will stop here and I will open up the class for any comments, any discussion. So anybody has anything to say, any comments? Nikhil?
Good evening, sir. So I just wanted to just emphasize on what I was also reading about democracy recently from the Western perspective. So I also like the way Dr. Ambedkar also mentioned about giving importance to the individual. So because fundamental rights can only be you can say um, origin if there are individual as well as natural rights are also you can say given importance than the lawmaking of the country.
Right, right, right. Good, 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 good. You see the scope of the democracy and the definitions that have been there. And you can of course trace a lot of this into the Constitution of India, like the fundamental rights, right to vote, right to office, any office under the Constitution. And there is so much that we can trace into Constitution. So as we have discussed, that this is not just about the articles, and it's about the principles. So you see these three principles of democracy, the principle of separation of power, and the principle of federalism. They found a very the keynote of the Constitution. Without democracy, the Constitution of India cannot exist, right? You liquidate democracy, our country is liquidated. Such is the power of democracy. But how do we uh, you know uh, the, solve the question of the minorities representation? What is happening to the political power, what is happening to the arising of the different political parties? Can we ourselves form a political party? What was Baba Ambedkar stand in a representative democracy? Can he access the power without a political party? Isn't
Right.
it?
That is why, like, reading between the lines of the articles is also very important, because what was the thought process behind mentioning that article or not mentioning explicitly any, you can say, word or a line, that is also very important.
Yes.
That we also saw in Constituent Assembly debates when it was happening. So a whole lot of thought process was behind mentioning each and every line.
Right. So I think this the material that we have and is very important, and I request you. I'm going to make the recording available to all of you, so that
Sir,
you
there
can
is one question on the chat that what is the difference between self and Brahma?
see. This is a kind of a rhetorical device that Baba Ambedkar has produced to convince the Hindus that they can have the democracy, because it's the foundational principle of their life. They don't have to believe in the caste system, isn't it? Like if you say that everything is Brahma, I am Brahma, and you are Brahma. Even if the Brahma is unknowable, he says many times that you cannot know Brahma. It's all, he says it's a foolish thing to do. But if you look at the principles underlying that I am that and you are also that, then it gives a kind of a foundation for a democracy. So he says Brahmaism can be a, can encourage Hindus to be democratic. But they all practice Brahmanism. And what is Brahmanism is a complete negation. Shankaracharya will talk about Brahma, and Maya, but he's upholding the caste system, isn't it? So Baba Ambedkar is trying to educate the people. He also talks about the discussions in the Vedas and all. So he's somebody who is not reactive. He is somebody who is trying to urge the people to think. And we have seen the intellectual democracy. One of the way Baba Ambedkar has talked about the intellectual the freedom to think, not just think in terms of a class, as a class, but as a humanity, as a common fraternity. They are all deep principles, right? So don't go much into self and philosophical part of it. Just try to see that Baba Ambedkar has talked about it in the context of democracy, and it's very easily understood. As I said, that what Baba Ambedkar brings to us is not something very abstract philosophization. These all principles of equality can be understood by anybody. We don't have to be a giant of an intellectual to understand all these constitutional principles, right?
Right. So there is one more question, that is Brahmanization a sin for India?
Undoubtedly, Brahmanism, Fascism, Nazism, they are all negation of the equality. Equality is the founding principle of democracy, right? As we have seen in the content of the talk.
Hello,
Yes, Jaya.
Jai Mangesh. Um, I have one question. At the beginning, you said that uh, democracy. Dr. Baba Sahib said that democracy changes its form time to time. So how does it changes? And in today's context,
See, for
how it
example,
changed?
yeah.
How it has changed?
See, for example, in India also there was a democracy before the constitution came into being, because these Indians were represented in the legislative assembly, but the electorate was limited. Only a few people can vote. The Brahmins could vote to the larger extent, and even the untouchables were not listed in the electoral code, electoral rolls. So that was a limited form of democracy where people were represented, but not all of them were represented. And that's how the form changes. But the underlying principle never changes. The principle of equality, the principle of liberty, the principle of fraternity, it never changes. So the form changes, like in for example, in the English history of democracy, they had undergone a lot of changes in the form. Even today, the English do not have the written constitution. They have the conventions. Their parliament is supreme. They can do anything. It is said that they cannot, change a man into women or women into man, but they have all the powers on the earth. So what I'm thinking, that is what Baba Ambedkar says, that the purpose of the democracy changes. When the democracy came into being after the French Revolution, it was to dislodge the power of a few people, the power of the king. So Baba Ambedkar says that now the ultimate purpose of democracy is to do the welfare of the people, isn't it? So it has changed the form, but the principles, underlying principles are the same. The natural rights are the same. They are inalienable. They cannot be changed.
Hmm.
Okay. Okay, then we will stop here for today if there are no immediate questions, and we will meet next week. So thank you all for joining. See you next week.
Daily, sir, daily, I have one question.
Yes, Ramjayamji.
Okay. I am at the Ramajayam History faculty
Yeah.
from Tamil Nadu state.
Yes, sir.
Okay, sir. A very nice presentation
Thank you.
and thought-provoking ideas.
Hmm.
Okay, I have one question. Equality is the concept of main theme of Baba Sahib Ambedkar. Okay,
Yes.
equality is a very focal theme. But nowadays, there is no equality in every walks of life of individuals.
Yes. True.
There is no equality. Education and employability and opportunity. Is there no equality? What is the reason? Is it ruled by Brahminism?
Yes. Because all Indian state is hijacked by the Brahminism.
Hijack.
Yeah.
Is it truly a democratic country? Baba Sahib Ambedkar enshrined the.
Yes, if you look at the principles and tally with what's happening in India today, we can say that there is a complete negation of democracy in the several walks of life.
In Tamil Nadu, one of the district, namely Pudukottai, there is one village that Vangavel is a very tragic untouchability. In Vangavel, human excreta in the drinking water. Is it
That's not
are
democracy.
we
That's not democracy. That's a complete negation of democracy.
complete negation of democracy?
Yeah.
There is no any social democracy.
There is no any social democracy. There is no economic democracy. There is only democracy as a top dressing.
Even we are living in 21st century. The hardcore Hindutva and hardcore casteist minded people mixed the human excreta in
Yes.
drinking water.
Yes.
Is it democratic India?
No.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Thank you.
So thank you. See you in the next class. Jai Bhim.